There are some places in America that don't forget. Places where the air feels thicker, where silence isn't peaceful, it's watching. And sometimes it's not the place that's haunted, it's the person who refuses to leave. Today's story isn't about a spree killer. It's not about a headline grabbing monster. It's about something quieter, something slower, a man who blended in until he didn't. A man who didn't just cross the line, he quietly erased it. This is the story of Robert Eugene Brashers. Welcome back to Meals To Unalive For. I'm Jody Breton, and this is where food and memory meet, and not everything stays in the past. Today, we're making lobster ravioli, tomato bruschetta, and a lemon ricotta cake. To understand Robert Brashers, you have to understand the kind of man no one really notices. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, he didn't demand attention. He was the kind of man you pass in a hallway and forget seconds later. Brashers lived a life that, on the surface, looked completely ordinary, working class, routine, predictable. But underneath that routine, something wasn't right. Robert Brashers had a pattern. He would insert himself into people's lives slowly and quietly, almost like mold creeping into the walls. He wasn't breaking in, he wasn't being invited. That's what made it so unsettling. He presented himself as helpful, dependable, even kind. The kind of man who offers to fix things, run errands, be around, and then he just never left. At first, it seems harmless, but over time, people started to notice something off. Brashers didn't just visit, he embedded. He learned routines, watched habits, understood the rhythms of a household better than the people who actually lived there, and once he was in, he stayed. At some point, the line between guest and intruder disappeared entirely, and this is where things take a darker turn. Because Brashers didn't just overstay his welcome, he began to take ownership, not legally. Not openly, but psychologically, he acted like he belonged, like the space was his, like the people in it were part of his world now. And when someone starts believing that, that's when things get dangerous. Because if you think something is yours, you'll do anything to keep it. Eventually, the illusion couldn't hold. Something snapped, and when it did, the quiet man, the forgettable man, wasn't forgettable anymore. There wasn't a sudden explosion of rage. It was worse than that. It was unavoidable. Like watching a storm form for days, knowing exactly what's coming but not being able to stop it. The details of Brasher's crimes reveal something chilling. This wasn't impulsive, it was built, layer by layer until the outcome felt almost pre written. When everything finally came to light, people struggled to reconcile the two versions of Robert Brashers, the quiet helper and the man capable of what he'd done. But here's the thing, they were never separate, they were the same person. One just took longer to reveal itself. That's what makes this case linger, because there's no clean break, no moment where he became dangerous, he always was. It just took time for everyone else to see it. There's something deeply unsettling about someone who doesn't force their way in but is welcomed. Someone who doesn't break the rules, they bend them slowly until they don't exist anymore. It makes you question things. How well do we know the people we let into our lives? At what point is it already too late? Robert Eugene Brashers was born on March 13th, 1958, in Newport, Virginia. The youngest of four children born to Doulis and Nellie Brashers, he started life in what, on the surface, looked completely ordinary. At some point during his childhood, the family relocated to Huntsville, Alabama, a move that would shape the environment he grew up in, but not necessarily the man he would become. Because here's what's unsettling about Brasher's early years: there were no obvious warning signs. No violent outbursts, no arrests, no spiral into drugs or alcohol. By all accounts, his teenage years were uneventful. The kind of quiet normalcy that really raises concern and almost never raises suspicion. After graduating high school, Brashers enlisted in the United States Army, but his military path didn't follow a straight line. At some point, he transitioned into service with the United States Navy, where he spent several years. Two branches, one structured life. Discipline, routine, and order. The kind of environment meant to build stability, and in many cases, it does. But for Brashers, it may have simply delayed something that had not surfaced yet. By the early 1980s, he stepped away from military life entirely, and that's when things began to shift. He moved to New Orleans, Louisiana, a city known for its energy, its chaos, its ability to let people disappear into it. But even that wasn't permanent. By the mid 1980s, Brashers moved again, this time to Fort Myers, Florida. Another fresh start, another reset. And somewhere along the way, he became a father. His daughter was born in 1991, which adds another layer to this story. Because while the world would eventually come to see Brashers as something far darker, at this point in his life, he was still building something that looked remarkably normal: a family, a future, a life that, from the outside, didn't raise any alarms. If there was a moment where the mask finally cracked, it came on November 22nd, 1985. By then, Robert Eugene Brashers was living in Florida, drifting between cities. That's when he met Michelle Wilkerson. She was 24 years old, the kind of encounter that starts off unremarkable: a meeting in Fort Pierce, a casual invitation to grab a drink. They spent the evening at a bar, talking, drinking, existing in that in between space where strangers decide whether they trust each other. At some point, Brashers offered her a ride, and she accepted. That decision, the kind people make every single day, would cost her everything. Instead of taking her home, he drove her somewhere else: a dark, isolated area near a citrus grove, away from lights, away from witnesses. The kind of place where sound doesn't carry and help doesn't come quickly. They sat there together, drinking 6 beers between them, and then he made his move. He tried to push things further, but Michelle said no. She tried to leave the car, to get out, to create distance, but he didn't let her go. A struggle broke out inside that vehicle. Tight space, nowhere to run, and in the chaos of that moment, Brashers pulled a gun. He fired once, striking her in the neck, and again hitting her in the head. 2 shots. At that distance, it should have been fatal. It was meant to be. But somehow, Michelle Wilkerson survived. Gravely injured, bleeding, disoriented, she managed to get out of the car. She ran. Not far, but far enough. She crawled into a culvert beneath the road, hiding in the dark, hoping he wouldn't find her. And for a moment, it worked, because Brashers couldn't locate her. Instead of searching further, he made a decision that feels almost surreal. He went to the beach and threw the gun in the ocean. Then he tried to leave, but even that didn't go according to plan. His truck became stuck in the sand, immobile. So now, this man who had just attempted to kill someone was walking the streets looking for help. Meanwhile, Michelle was still fighting to stay alive. She emerged from hiding and made her way to a nearby apartment building. Bleeding, in shock, but conscious, and incredibly, she was still able to speak. Before being taken to the hospital, she gave police a description, not just of him, but of his vehicle. Clear, detailed, enough to find him. And it didn't take long. Just minutes later, Robert Eugene Brashers was located wandering near the beach. And this time, he didn't blend in. He was arrested and charged with attempted first-degree murder, aggravated battery, use of a firearm during the commission of a crime. The following year, he was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison. But here's where the story takes a turn that feels frustratingly familiar. Because under the law at that time, good behavior meant early release. And on May 4th, 1989, Robert Eugene Brashers walked free after less than 4 years. 4 years for something that should have been a death sentence for his victim. And maybe, if things had gone differently, for him too. Because what happened that night was not just a violent outburst, it was a preview, a glimpse into what he was capable of, and more importantly, what he was willing to do when someone told him no. When Robert Eugene Brashers walked out of prison in 1989, he didn't stay still for long. He moved. South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, never settling, never rooted. Just drifting, like someone trying to stay one step ahead of something or someone. And less than a year later, that movement would intersect with something far darker. April 5th, 1990, Greensville, South Carolina. That's where Genevieve Jenny Zittrey, a 28-year-old woman, was found murdered in her apartment. What investigators walked into wasn't just a crime scene, it was a message. Jenny had been attacked inside her own home, a place that should have been safe. The violence was personal, up close, and deliberate. After the attack, her body was moved. taken from the bedroom and placed into a bathtub, submerged. Not hidden well enough to conceal the crime, but staged in a way that felt intentional, controlled. And then there was the mirror, written across it in a chilling final detail: "Don't mess with my family." It didn't make any sense. There was no clear connection, no obvious motive that explained the message, just a confusion and growing sense that this wasn't random. At the time, investigators collected what they could include in a DNA sample left behind by the killer. But in 1990, that evidence didn't have the power it does today. It would take years, decades really, before it meant anything. By 1995, that DNA profile was finally entered into CODIS, the national database designed to connect crimes across time and place. And still, nothing. The case went cold. Another name, another file, another family left waiting. But what investigators didn't know then, what they couldn't prove, was that Robert Eugene Brashers was already there, living in Greenville, not far from Jenny's apartment. Close enough that this wasn't coincidence, just proximity and opportunity. It wouldn't be until years later, after technology caught up, that the truth finally surfaced. The DNA matched perfectly. Robert Eugene Brashers was the man who killed Jenny Zedricki, which means this. Less than a year after his release from prison, after already attempting to take a life in 1985, he crossed the line completely, and this time, no one survived. For years, Robert Eugene Brashers was just a ghost in the system. A man who moved, a man who escalated, a man who left behind fragments, but never answers until technology caught up. In 2019, long before his name would resurface in headlines, his daughter spoke. Deborah, 27 years old at the time, shared what it was like to live with him. She said she first met her father in 1997, right after he had been released from prison. And for the next 2 years, the exact window where his crimes escalated, he lived with her mother, with her sisters. A family shared space with a man no one fully understood. At times, she said, he was aggressive, unpredictable. There were fights, one severe enough that he injured her stepfather with a drill. But what stands out most is something quieter, something deeply unsettling. She described him testing himself, recording as he made small cuts on his own body, as if trying to measure pain, as if trying to understand something about himself, or prove that he could endure it. And then there's what her mother allegedly did, telling the family to call him by a different name, to keep him inside. As if hiding him could somehow contain what he was. Looking back now, it feels less like protection and more like containment, because during this time, he wasn't just living with them. He was leaving for days, sometimes weeks, working a construction job that kept him on the move, or so it seemed. But in April of 1998, something shifted again. According to Deborah, his mental state deteriorated rapidly, and if you line that up with the timeline, it matches exactly with his most violent period. The breakthrough, 2025, then decades later, the silence broke. In July 2025, investigators received a call that would change everything. A match, not from witnesses, not from a confession, but from a machine. The National Integrated Ballistic Information Network linked a shell casing from the Kentucky crime scene to one recovered in Austin, Texas in 1991. The Austin Yogurt Shop murders. Two crime scenes 7 years apart, connected by a single piece of metal. And that was just the beginning. Because then the DNA matched. Evidence from both scenes pointed to the same man, Robert Eugene Brashers, and in September 2025, that connection was confirmed even further. Testing of the evidence from the Kentucky case specifically tied to Linda Rutledge, matching the same genetic profile. Linda Rutledge would be the last victim of Brashers and would be the case to tie everything together. On the morning of November 7, 1998, just after 7:40 a.m., the Lexington Fire Department responded to a call at a small business, the Nixon Hearing Aid Center. Smoke was already pouring from the building when crews arrived. They moved fast, entered, contained the fire, cleared the space, and then in the back of the hallway, they found her. 43-year-old Linda Rutledge. At first glance, it looked like a fire scene. But it wasn't, because the fire wasn't what killed her. She had been shot multiple times in the head. The flames, the smoke, those came after, an attempt to cover what had already been done, to erase it, to turn violence into something accidental. And for years, that's exactly what it became: another case, another victim, and no clear answer. It wouldn't be until September 2025 that investigators finally named the man responsible, Robert Eugene Brashers, through DNA and ballistic evidence that confirmed what no one could prove in 1998. And this wasn't an isolated crime, it was part of something bigger. By the late 1990s, something had changed. If Robert Eugene Brashers had once been careful, if he had once taken his time, that restraint was now gone. What followed next was faster, closer together, and far more dangerous. It started with a knock on the door. Inside the house were 5 people. March 11th, 1997, in Memphis, Tennessee, was a normal night. Nothing unusual until Brashers forced his way inside. He was armed with a revolver, and from the moment he entered, he took control. He restrained everyone in the home, 5 people overpowered inside their own space. And then he targeted one of them, a 14-year-old girl. What makes this moment so unsettling isn't just the violence, it's how deliberate it was. This wasn't hidden or rushed. This was someone walking into a home and deciding he owned it. No hesitation, no fear of being stopped, just control. Brashers would assault the 14-year-old and luckily leave everyone involved alive, which couldn't be said for his next 2 victims less than a year later. On March 28th, 1998, in Portridge, Missouri, that control turned deadly once again. Inside their home, Sherry Scher and her 12-year-old daughter, Megan Scher, were attacked. They were restrained. The violence was methodical and planned. Megan would be sexually assaulted, and it ended with both of their lives being taken with a .22 caliber firearm. This wasn't escalation anymore, this was a pattern. And then, just 2 hours later, he did it again. Another home, another forced entry, this time a 25-year-old woman. But this encounter didn't go the way the others had. She fought back, and for the first time in this sequence, he ran. No DNA was left behind, but it didn't matter because the gun told the story. The same weapon used in Missouri was used here, which means this wasn't just violence, it was a spree. On April 12th, 1998, something finally interrupted him. Brashers attempted to break into another home, but this time the target wasn't random. He had known this woman before, had even worked for her, which makes this moment feel different, more personal and more calculated. Before attempting entry, he cut the phone line. He came prepared, armed, but this time he didn't get inside. He was caught. When police arrested him, they found more than just a weapon. They recovered locksmith tools, a video camera, tools that suggested planning not just for entry, but for control, for time, for something that might have gone on longer if he had not been stopped. He was taken into custody, and for a moment, it looked like it might end there. But it didn't, because once again, he made bail and walked free. By this point, the pattern was impossible to ignore. He wasn't waiting for opportunity anymore, he was creating it. One house, one door, and one victim at a time. And the time between each attack was getting shorter. Different investigators, no clear thread connecting them, but Brashers was the thread, moving quietly between places, leaving just enough behind, but never enough to stop him, until time did what the system couldn't. It waited, and then it answered. Some killers are caught in the moment, some are caught by witnesses, and some are caught decades later, by the evidence they thought would disappear. Let's talk more about the yogurt shop murders, because over 30 years had come and gone before we truly knew what happened. December 6, 1991, just before midnight, a police officer in Austin, Texas, noticed something was wrong. Fire coming from a small shop on West Anderson Lane. It was an I can't believe it's yogurt shop. Inside, firefighters would find something far worse than flames. 4 girls. 17-year-old Jennifer Habison, 15-year-old Sarah Habison, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas, and 13-year-old Amy Ayers. Two of them worked there, and two were just there to help close up. The girls had planned to have a sleepover after they finished at the shop. A normal night until it wasn't. They had been bound, gagged, and shot, and the fire was meant to erase everything. For decades, investigators chased leads, thousands of tips, and over 50 confessions. Within a week of the murders, 16-year-old Maurice Pierce was arrested for bringing a gun to North Cross Mall. The gun happened to be the same make and model as one of the guns used in the murder. After hours of interrogation by APD homicide detective Hector Polanco, now retired, he confessed to the murders of the four girls. The following morning, Detective Jones interviewed Pierce again, but realized his confession did not match the details of the crime scene. Additionally, ballistics analyzed the .22 gun that was seized from Pierce at the mall to determine if it was the same weapon used in the murders, and the results were inconclusive. In 1999, the Yogurt Shop Task Force revisited the case and reviewed the original case files in further detail. The task force interrogated four subjects that had been identified as possibly being involved: Maurice Pierce, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and Forrest Welburn. During the interrogations, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott confessed and both implicated each other in the murders. Forrest Welburn and Maurice Pierce did not confess. At the time, the task force theory was that Welburn waited outside in the car as the lookout. Forrest Welburn never confessed to the murders. All four subjects were arrested for capital murder in 1999. Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen were put in jail, and both were found guilty based on each other's confessions implicating one another. Michael Scott received life without parole, and Robert Springsteen received the death penalty. Forrest Welburn was no billed, which means a decision was made by the grand jury not to indict Welburn for the crime because there was not enough evidence to support a formal charge. The charges against Maurice Pierce were dropped. No physical evidence at the scene was ever linked to any of the subjects. Due to the new ruling, Crawford v. Washington, the Court of Criminal Appeals granted a new trial for Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen, and the charges were dropped, leaving the truth exactly where it started: unknown. I thought it was important to include this part of the yogurt shop murders and what happened after, because police were so sure that it was these four men that murdered the four girls at the yogurt shop, when really it was Robert Eugene Brashers, who was never on their radar at all. But evidence has a way of waiting. Even when people don't, years passed, technology changed, and what once looked like nothing started to speak. DNA collected from the scene, retested, reanalyzed, began to form a profile: a single unknown male. Still no name. But closer. Then, in 2025, everything shifted. A shell casing, a .380 cartridge that had been sitting in evidence for years, was finally run through the updated systems. And it hit. Not locally, and not even in Texas, but Kentucky. A completely separate case, the murder of Linda Rutledge. 7 years apart, different states, same weapon. That was the first crack. Then came the DNA. A full profile match linked the yogurt shop crime scene to the 1990 murder in South Carolina. And that's when the name finally surfaced: Robert Eugene Brashers. By the time investigators identified him, he was already gone. Dead since 1999. Never arrested for these crimes, never questioned about them, never held accountable. But the connections didn't stop there. Less than 48 hours after the yogurt shop murders, Brashers had been stopped by Border Patrol, driving a stolen car in possession of a .380 pistol, the same weapon he would later use to end his own life. The same weapon linked back to one of the girls. It was all there, just not in the right order, not at the right time. For nearly 34 years, this case existed as a question, a wound that never closed. Families waited, a city marked, and a man moving through it all unseen, until he wasn't, because the time doesn't erase everything. Sometimes, it just waits for the truth to catch up. Some stories end with justice, and some end with answers. and some end with a name finally attached to something that never should have happened. On January 13th, 1999, police in Kennett, Missouri located a stolen vehicle in the parking lot of a Super 8 motel. That discovery led them to Robert Eugene Brashers. What followed was a standoff. Brashers took his wife, daughter, and two stepdaughters hostage. Eventually, he released them, but he refused to surrender. After roughly 4 hours of negotiation, he shot himself in the head. He didn't die immediately. For 6 days, he remained alive before dying from his injuries on January 19th, 1999. His death was ruled a suicide, and at that time, that could have been the end of his story, but it wasn't. Most of what he had done hadn't been connected yet. What makes Brashers especially unsettling isn't just what he did, it's how long it took to understand it. He died in 1999, but many of his crimes weren't connected to him until 2025, 2026, which means for decades his victims had no answers, no name, and no resolution. As for the meal, I wasn't a huge fan of this one, if I'm being honest. I love ravioli, but I felt like the lobster was a bit much. I think I would have preferred like a mushroom or a cheese ravioli. The bruschetta was really good, and I liked the lemon ricotta cake. It was just more of like a simple sort of like pound cake, if you like that sort of thing. So I just don't feel like making the lobster and doing, like, the filling and everything was worth the time, for something that was just okay. But, let me know what you guys thought about this case down in the comments, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.